Bloomberg Technology is live from Southern California, live from Long Beach. And the focus is on defense and space technology, of which there is a high concentration in SoCal. And there are specific names in that industry. One of them is Katherine Boyle of Andreessen Horowitz, who is backing American Dynamism, is backing startups at the cutting edge of defense and space technology. And Katherine joins us now. And that's where we start. I know Southern California so well. And I note that increasingly we are covering defense tech on this program, and we've been covering space technology for a little period of time now. Why Southern California? Why is there a concentration of activity there, Katherine?
Well, I think there's a couple great historical reasons for why Southern California has really become a defense and aerospace hub. One is that it's always been that way. When you think of sort of the traditional primes, they have historically been based in Southern California. But then, of course, a little company came along a couple decades ago called SpaceX and decided to build in Southern California versus Silicon Valley. And when you think about just the long story of SpaceX really training up, I always say that the one of the major gifts that Elon Musk has given the country is that he's trained 2 generations of manufacturing talent and of engineering talent at SpaceX. And that talent is based in Southern California. And so when you look at sort of the companies that are coming out of this defense tech movement, a lot of them have been trained at places like SpaceX, or they got their start there. And then they're building new startups and deciding to build where there's a concentration of talent, which is in Southern California. So in many ways, that is a huge part of the story of that region. And people, because they live there and because the density has only grown with new and new startups, you're seeing sort of the benefits of that talent density.
Katherine, I wrote to Elon Musk and I wrote to SpaceX and I invited them to participate in the program, and we didn't hear from them. But something interesting that developed during the planning of the show is Elon Musk's announcement that he'd moved SpaceX's kind of technical headquarters from Hawthorne to Texas. The question I have for you is, does that create a bit of a vacuum or an opportunity for other companies who can attract talent that wants to stay there?
Well, I think there's a lot of talent that wants to stay in Southern California, but I think it also brings up a great point that there are emerging tech hubs. There are new places where talent is going. Texas is certainly, a place that's been very good at attracting talent in the last few years for a number of reasons. I think you are seeing sort of this great dispersion of talent, which is a good thing. When we think about sort of where venture capitalists in particularly have historically invested, it's always been sort of this meme of we invest in Silicon Valley. And now we're talking about places like Southern California. Anduril, I think, did something that was considered very contrarian when they founded Anduril in 2017, which was they said, we're going to build in Orange County, California. We're not going to build in San Francisco. We're not going to build in Silicon Valley. And that turned out to be a smart and wise decision in terms of being able to build very fast and to take advantage of that Southern California talent. And I think you're seeing this sort of next generation of defense tech and aerospace companies choosing different locations. And Texas has certainly been attractive for a lot of those founders. The Austin ecosystem is a very vibrant hard tech ecosystem as well. Of course, it takes time to build these ecosystems. One of the questions that I always get is, are any of these alternative tech hubs actually competing with San Francisco? And remember, it's, San Francisco and Silicon Valley have an extraordinary head start at a lot of these new movements, but you are seeing capital move to these areas. You're seeing talent move to these areas and wanting to build in new hubs where there is space. And I think that over the next decade, we're going to see emerging tech hubs focused on hard tech emerge outside of the traditional Silicon Valley ecosystem.
American Dynamism. What are the environmental factors, industry factors in SoCal that make it a good place for American Dynamism to play out?
Well, so I think it's a Southern California story, but it's also a broader American story. So I am often asked the question, where did American Dynamism come from? It feels like there's been an extraordinary change in the industry, and why is that happening? And I always go back to, Mark Andreessen, the founder of our firm, wrote, I think, a very poignant essay during COVID called "It's Time to Build." And it kind of kicked off this question of, and he actually points to the moment where it hit him that we need to build more in the physical world. And it was very early in COVID, when New York City hospitals and the best country in the world were asking citizens to deliver ponchos to the hospitals because we did not manufacture enough PPE for this historic moment, which was COVID. And I think it sort of opened up the question of, how is it that America is not building? How is it that we're not manufacturing? Why is it that our defense industrial base has lost, has lost its innovation? There were all these questions, I think, that kind of came out of that essay. And then, of course, only 2 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine and sort of opened up the minds, I think, of a lot of early and career engineers and founders who had never seen, a live war in Europe. For many of these founders that are in our portfolio or engineers that are founding engineers of extraordinary American Dynamism companies, they do not remember September 11th. They were too young in many cases. And so I think you have this extraordinary movement coming together, which is there are now enough companies that have scaled and have become either public companies or large enough startups, large enough private companies, where the talent is leaving those companies and encouraged to found new companies in the ecosystem. You also have these, as Southern California is, it's a talent hub, but you also have this really interesting moment, which is, these historic events back to back that opened people's eyes and said, okay, the 2020s are very different than the previous tech generation. Right. And we're not just going to be building software, we're going to build hardware and software that supports the national interest. And when people ask me, what is American Dynamism? The clearest definition is there are companies that support the national interest and the interests of our allies. And that can be building in the physical world. It's often defense, aerospace, energy, these very hard physical things that need to be built that the government and that America cares deeply about.
I think our experience of that on Bloomberg Technology, of American Dynamism, but also sort of the awareness stemming from the war in Ukraine as an example, has been Anduril. They've been vocal about it. But what's the next Anduril? I mean, you must be looking for new innovation. Where are you seeing that? And what kinds of startups are you looking at? I mean, Anduril is an unusually hardware-focused name that also has competence in software.
So Anduril is a perfect example of a company where, I think Anduril always points to how long it took SpaceX and how long it took Palantir to get those first contracts from the U.S. government. It took them a very long time. And of course, Anduril did this at a historic pace, founded in 2017. By 2020, they had their first program of record. And I think if we take a step back, it actually shows us that the government has woken up to the need to work with startups, which was not the case in the early 2010s. It was not the case when sort of the defense 1.0 generation was really building. So Anduril has shown that you can move much faster. And the thing that I think is really interesting is the success of Anduril has begotten success for startups that were founded in the last few years. The program that we always love to point to is Replicator, which was a program focused on working with startups and focusing on production that the Defense Department needs, that has become a core initiative out of the DoD under this administration. Previous administrations really focused on the Defense Innovation Unit, where it was building ties to Silicon Valley, understanding that the best engineers in the world are in Silicon Valley and that the DoD has to work with them. So I think that we always look at the private industry side, which is that there's now a talent density, there's momentum, there's capital that has really met this movement so that we can build startups. But that would mean nothing if there wasn't an eager buyer. And the DoD has become an extraordinarily eager buyer, supportive of working with startups, understanding that they need to be a lot more thoughtful about procurement. They need to make it possible for earlier stage companies to be able to sell into the Department of Defense. And that also these large legacy primes, which have had no competition for, in many cases, 50 to 100 years, now have to start working with startups. And they have to integrate the technologies that these startups built if they want to be the chosen supplier to the DoD. So we have seen this extraordinary change in how the DoD views startups as a possible supplier for the requirements that they have.
In your world, you just listed all of the factors that you consider when something crosses your desk. Availability of capital, the innovation, the founder themselves. And that makes me want to discuss Miami, frankly. Andreessen was excited about Miami and then pulled back a little bit. Was it just some of those factors weren't as pronounced as you thought they were going to be after 2 years there?
Well, so I think, when you're building a new innovation hub and the migration we saw into states like Texas and Florida over the last few years, it really is a 30-year project, not a 3-year project. And of course, when we're talking about tech companies, we like to think in quarters. We don't like to think in decades. But the migration, and I think the movement to these states is really an exceptional story of what's happening in America. And I don't think that we can bet against it. I think that, when you've seen the amount of talent that's decided to either stay in these states or is leaving places like New York and California and moving to these states to build companies and to build, frankly, new movements. Like, I actually think that this is, I am not any less bullish on the state of Florida as a Florida resident. I'm super excited to be here. And I think that, building up these ecosystems to a talent density often takes time. And what Texas, frankly, has and what Florida has that they didn't have 5-7 years ago is they do have people who've built companies before. They have capital. A lot of the capital, as you know, has moved to Miami, both on the public market side and the private side. So there is sort of, I'd say, the sea change that has happened in the last few years, and that will only continue.
Katherine, we started this conversation talking about how SpaceX opened the door. They were first, and then it had a ripple effect over a number of years in Southern California. But of course, in Florida, at Kennedy Space Center in particular, SpaceX has a presence. Do they have the same impact on the tech ecosystem in that state as well?
Again, I think these are long journeys, and SpaceX is a company where I believe we've only started seeing the impact that they've had on the U.S. and frankly on the entire ecosystem. So again, it's a 20-year-old company, but it's a company with a story that I think is much longer than that. And so the impact that it's having on Florida or Texas, I think we'll only be able to look back in years and decades and be able to look at those effects kind of in hindsight. But ultimately, I think the story of SpaceX is an American story, and if you have followed the trajectory versus if looking at it as sort of the company that's not only affected all of deep tech and all of aerospace, but really has affected how the Department of Defense operates, it's a story that I think we are only starting to see how extraordinary that company has been for America.